Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our civil conversation with Dr. Peniel Joseph on his book, The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. I want to thank our sponsor for tonight, UPMC Central PA, making this helping to make this a free event for all of you tonight as well. And a little bit about us, the National Civil War Museum. We tell the entire story of the American Civil War from its the lead up to the war through Reconstruction. And so tonight's event is a perfect fit and tie into our mission and what we do here as a museum. And just to put out a little historical fact for tonight, it also happens to be the 162nd anniversary of the surrender of Fort Sumter in 1861, which of course was the outbreak of the war and really leads into what we're talking about tonight. And the series itself is a new series that this is our first venture down this road, and it explores topics that were relevant in the Civil War that remain so today. And obviously, talking about Reconstruction and its legacy certainly fits that bill. And for tonight, our run of show, Dr. Joseph and I will have a little conversation about his book and his work. And then we'll open it up to questions. And some of you have already begun to put some information into the chat. So if you have a question you'd like us to share with Dr. Joseph, please put it into the chat and we'll get to those over the course of the program. And we also have copies of his book, as you see behind me and right here, The Third Reconstruction, available for sale in our bookstore. Peniel was kind enough to sign those for us. So if you'd like an autographed copy of his book, follow the link that Dane put into the chat, or you can go directly to our homepage at nationalcivilwarmuseum.org, and there's a nice link up there that basically says purchase the book here, and that'll bring you to our store where you can buy that book. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Peniel Joseph. Dr. Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. And his career has focused on Black Power studies, which encompass interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and of course, political science and history. In addition to being a frequent commentator on the issues of race, democracy, and civil rights, Dr. Joseph is the author of award-winning books on American history, including The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and Stokely A Life. And of course, today he's here to speak with us on his latest book, The Third Reconstruction. Welcome, Dr. Joseph. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me.
Well, you know, to dive right in, you open your book with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'll just read it to you if you haven't read the book yet. A land that described America as a land of poignant beauty, streaked with hate and blood and shame, where God was worshipped wildly, where human beings were bought and sold, where even the 20th century men are burned alive, or even in the 20th century men are burned alive. And in many ways, it sets the stage for your book, not completely, but a good subset of it. And so with that, if you could just tell us why you wrote this book, what led you to it, and then if you could also identify those three reconstructions, those periods for the audience, so it sort of sets the stage for our conversation.
Oh, certainly. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. So this is my seventh book, so I've been doing this for a long time. And I think what set the stage for this, you know, I talk about it because the book is part memoir too, is the influence of my mother, who was a Haitian immigrant who came to the United States in 1965, Jermaine Joseph. She recently passed. And just the influence that she had on me in terms of telling me stories about Haitian and American history and African-American history. She got me interested in the presidents of the United States, the vice presidents of the United States, going to the local library. I mean, I memorized the presidents going all the way up to Jimmy Carter when I was in kindergarten and first grade. Wow. So she was very much a very specific person. She was a hospital worker at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, local 1199. I was on picket lines, demonstrations. And she was a huge, prodigious reader. Like at home, we had, hundreds of books at home in mom's library. My older brother is a physician, and I'm the black sheep of the family as a professor. He's doing something worthwhile. And
Could
so,
be worse.
in a lot of ways, we used to talk about all these issues in American history at the dinner table. We used to talk about labor movements and social justice movements and feminist movements. And we had conversations about capitalism, conversations about socialism, conversations about Christianity and religion and justice and Jesus. Like that was the conversation at home. We talked about Shakespeare, but mom loved Toni Morrison. She loved Bobby Kennedy. So we had biographies of Bobby Kennedy in the house. So those are, that was kind of like my household. And until I got to high school and got to other people's, I thought everybody sort of lived like that, sort of talked like that.
No, I don't think that's the case.
I discovered it. And so in a lot of ways, this book let me sort of think about how history has been utilized in my own family, in my own biography, not just professionally, but also personally. And the reason I was so interested in Reconstruction is that, one of the things, Jeff, what we do to students, like I have a PhD in American history from Temple University, and my technical proficiencies are American history from 1865 to the present, social history from 1930 to the present, African American history from Reconstruction to the present, and then feminism and sort of white and Black feminisms comparatively, right? And that's kind of like what I went to school for. But then, you have to write a dissertation, you have to get tenure, all those different things. And so my focus was, civil rights, Black power, sort of 20th century America was my focus, post-war America. I've written on Obama as well. But really over the last 15, 20 years, after I finished my PhD 23 years ago, I still continue to read big, really heavy books on the Civil War and Reconstruction. So we're thinking about Stephen Hahn, A Nation Under Our Feet, all of Eric Foner's work, all of it, all of John Meacham's work, all of it. Historians like Tavolia Glimpf and Crystal Feimster and Beverly Guy Sheftall and Nell Irvin Painter, and so many different historians, including, James McPherson and Battle Cry Freedom. So, I mean, this is, so even as I continue to read about civil rights, read about Black power, I was intensely interested on racial slavery, the Civil War, including reading books on the Civil War and the battles of Vicksburg. And this is like, I'm interested, And so in a lot of ways, especially after Barack Obama's election, but then especially after 2016, and the rise of sort of MAGA and what was going on in the country, I came to be really interested in the way in which there were parallels between what was unfolding in our contemporary with not just civil rights in the 60s, because everybody talks about, 2020, it's like the 60s, the 1960s or the 1950s, but really the 1860s and the 1870s and the 1880s. So that's what really I found really compelling. And fortunately for me, I had continued to, again, read Sven Becker's Empire of Cotton and Ed Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, Dinah Ramey Berry's The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Just so many, to me, just very intriguing books on Reconstruction and the Civil War. And these new works have really shown us the intrinsic connection between the Reconstruction period, the Civil War period, and our own. So even as we can talk about 1619 to the present, love Nicole Hannah Jones, and I teach that book, but America is much more like the way it was starting on the eve of the Civil War to the present than at any other time, really. That other earlier period absolutely counts. We should study it. We should look at linkages. But really, the country we live in now is so eerily similar to the issues and the controversies, the challenges, the opportunities we faced 160 years ago.
Yeah, and as you bring that up, you mentioned sort of the moment we live in. And one of my professors back in college often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think you've shared that in your book as well. And so you can, and that's why you study history, obviously. You go back, and so you're able to see these these issues, bring them forward, and help make some sense. Nothing is perfectly aligned, but certainly enables you to have a critical thought and critical thinking skills that enable you to make sound decisions and at least interpret the era you're living through. That's a critical piece. And to get back to the to your book title, can you define those three eras for us, the three reconstructions?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the first Reconstruction, I'm one who argues for a long Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1898.
Right.
So I actually push back against presidential Reconstruction. And I do it for a number of reasons, but the primary reason is that I think even after 1876 and the election of 1876 and the removal of Union troops, you see archipelagos of democracy built by Black folks, at times in solidarity with whites and others during this period. So I go from 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment all the way up until the massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina, November 8th, 9th, 10th of 1898. Over 100 Black folks are killed, thousands flee, and Wilmington goes from being this interracial government and experiment in multiracial democracy to really becoming a headquarters of white supremacy. And really, more than even the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, we see 1898 as the end of Reconstruction. We're going to see an uptick in what historians are going to call the Great Migration. And we think about the works of Isabel Wilkerson and Nicholas Lehman and others on migration. And the second Reconstruction is really 1954 to 1968. Those are really the heroic years of the Civil Rights Movement from May 17th, 1954, and the Brown Supreme Court decision outlawing or basically saying that racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, all the way up until the Thursday, April 4th, 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. And in between, we have all those different markers. Emmett Till on August 28th, 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, December 1st, 1955, with Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon, a young Martin Luther King Jr., the 1957 Little Rock Central High School crisis, the 1960 lunch counter sit-ins, February 1st, 1960, Woolworth's lunch counter, which is now a Civil Rights Museum, the 1961 Freedom Rides with John Lewis and Diane Nash, Stokely Carmichael arrested, among others, the 1962 James Meredith becomes the first Black student enrolled, and the Oxford, Mississippi showdown, which is again another Reconstruction parallel and showdown. Right. Over 500 U.S. federal marshals have to escort James Meredith into a public institution, and Kennedy sends that in the South. You know, Kennedy, we have the declassified documents of Kennedy being on the phone with the governor of Mississippi, the governor of these different places, who say, hey, we feel like we're being attacked and this is going to be another civil war. 1963 is the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's also the spring of Birmingham, Alabama, King's letter from Birmingham jail, John F. Kennedy's race speech, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the March on Washington, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and also the assassination of Kennedy. And then 1964 is the passage of the Civil Rights Act and Freedom Summer, where the 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 Black, are killed, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. 1965 is Selma and Bloody Sunday, where future Congressman John Lewis again is attacked and he gets his skull fractured twice, once in 1961 and once in 1965. And he survives to become this luminary and this sort of American prophet. But then we see the passage of the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. And then in 66, 67, 68, we see all these different urban rebellions. We see the rise of the Black Panthers. We see pushback against the Great Society, critiques of the Vietnam War, Dr. King's Poor People's March, and really a kind of deep cynicism that sets in after the assassinations of both King and Bobby Kennedy. And that's the second. And in the third Reconstruction, I argue, Jeff, is really from 2008 to the present. You know, my 4 pivot points, hinge points in history, I argue, are the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, 1.0, the rise of President Trump and the Make America Great Again movement and sort of this white nationalist movement that really echoes not just the 1960s, but certainly the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s. And then 2020 and George Floyd and the so-called racial and political reckoning of 2020 and all the juxtapositions there where the racial disparities of the pandemic, the racially divisive presidential election, but also soul searching, people saying that they wanted to do better, Black history books selling out and different corporations saying Black Lives Matter and presidential candidates and different people saying there needs to be more racial justice. Then at the same time, we get the big lie and January 6th and a real huge sort of racial backlash alongside of a kind of progress. So those are what I mean in that sense by Reconstruction. On one level, you get the first Black woman Supreme Court justice, you get the first Black woman Vice President of the United States, you get the promise of racial equity, and paralleling that promise is real backlash in terms of voter suppression, the critical race theory hoax, really more than a controversy, the suppression of speech. You know, if you talk about the Holocaust, or if you talk about slavery in K through 12 schools, the banning of that speech, the Dobbs decision, the banning of reproductive justice, it's all connected, right? And so what's so interesting about this third Reconstruction is that there continues to be this narrative war, and I write about this in the book, between Reconstructionist supporters of multiracial democracy versus redemptionist advocates of the lost cause, white supremacy. During the first Reconstruction period, redemptionists decisively win that war. They win it politically, they win it through physical violence, they win it legally and legislatively. During the second Reconstruction, Reconstructionists win that war. And that's why you can get Barack Obama and you can get the Congressional Black Caucus, but not just they win the war between Blacks and whites, they really win that war where you get a multiracial democracy. You have a Congressional Hispanic Caucus, you have Indigenous representation, you have Asian American Pacific Islander representation, and you also have queer and women represented for the first time. So when you think about the second Reconstruction, the notion of a rising tide lifts all boats. So many different groups are impacted by the civil rights struggle within the second Reconstruction, not just Black, white divides, but people who are disabled, people who are queer, working class people. So it's really this panoramic. And now in this third Reconstruction, we're really litigating what we litigated 2 times before during the first and second. We're still litigating voting rights. We're still litigating what do we think about, how do we define citizenship and freedom when it comes to guns, when it comes to reproductive justice, when it comes to freedom of speech, right? And both sides, do different things. They're Reconstructionists and Redemptionists. You think about this idea of cancel culture. You're going to have some Reconstructionists, and you see it on social media, who do say they want people to stop saying things. But then you have Redemptionists with even more political power who cancel people through legislation. So it's not a kind of social media shaming for making a mistake. It's saying literally in 35, 36 states, you can't teach this, right? So what's so interesting is, like we've seen during the first Reconstruction, the narrative wars take place between 2 sides that have unequal power.
Yeah, and so my next question was going to be about that very topic, about Reconstructionist, Redemptionist. I think you've kind of laid that out enough so that people understand the difference between those 2 categories. And that's something that's also been prevalent through American history and continues today. And it's that clash between those 2 ideas or concepts that really leads to a lot of the tension that we all face today.
Absolutely. And especially one thing, Jeff, this is really an issue of how do we define democracy? Because redemptionism has always been anti-multiracial democracy. So it doesn't want women to vote. It doesn't want poor people to vote, Black people to vote. Redemptionism is not a big tent vision of American democracy. It's anti-democracy. It's interested in minority rule. It's interested in subjugating and marginalizing people because the Confederate States of America had argued And we know this, me and you were talking about John Meacham's brilliant new book, and there was a light about Abraham Lincoln, which everyone should read. He talks about the Confederate States of America and how even before the Civil War, they dreamed of an empire of slavery that was hemispheric, that stretched to Cuba and the Caribbean and stretched to Central America and Latin America. And they wanted to colonize Mexico, all of it, right, for this empire of slavery, right? So it's really, really remarkable. So when we think about redemptionism and this idea of the lost cause, it certainly is also anti-American as you define Americanism with the unionism of Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, et cetera.
Yeah, and you mentioned historians before. Another great historian that has done a lot of work in this area is David Blight from Yale University, and you quote him obviously. And part of the misconception I think that people quite often think, at least, and even the people living at the time believe that slavery would die of natural causes, right? Over time, it would be replaced by something else. The economics wouldn't work. And he points out, in one of his speeches that he gave, that in 1860, essentially slavery was at its apex. It was at one of the strongest points in its history. And I think this leads up to what you were saying, and that the war itself was over, of course, slavery and its expansion. And so that idea of how to continue to grow that, and those conflicting tides of the North being a free state, Southerns being enslaved states, and that was the friction that really led to the war. And just amazing. I wrote down this quote because he said in 1860 there were about 4 million enslaved people in the United States, predominantly in the South, obviously, and that the value of that was $3.5 billion in their money, the value of those enslaved people. So you can imagine what that number would be today, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Oh, absolutely.
So you have that economic reality of all of this as well that led to the causes of the separation.
Oh, absolutely. The Civil War was fought over slavery and its expansion. And that's why, Lincoln is a very interesting figure and a complex figure because he's willing to do anything he can to preserve the Union. And he even says that. So for him, and obviously, people can criticize this and it's fine to, but it's a complicated figure in the sense that he wants to preserve the Union, whether that means preserving the status quo, whether that means tinkering with it, or whether it means unfettered emancipation, right? And really by the end of the war, he's really thinking more about voting rights, but even then he's not as radical as people like Thaddeus Stevens, who I talk about. He thinks he meets with Frederick Douglass 3 times. He's impressed with Douglass, and he thinks Black men who are educated and remarkable should have the right to vote, right? But that really doesn't help the entire community because you need Black political power. And if the only people could vote in the United States were remarkable people, I mean, how do you judge that? Right?
I wouldn't be voting. Right.
Who's going to be the judge of who's remarkable enough to vote?
Exactly. And so that's all part of that idea. And so, the other thing that I think as we're looking at the Reconstruction era, and there's a question online I see, which we'll get to in a minute, about Reconstruction, but you mentioned already presidential Reconstruction. You've mentioned there's radical Reconstruction. Can you define those two for the audience and how they played out?
Yes. Presidential Reconstruction, unfortunately, plays out from Abraham Lincoln's April 14th assassination around then, all the way to 1868 and the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So there's basically a 3-year period where Andrew Johnson, who's really a Democratic Unionist, a white supremacist, but who stays within the context of the Union, becomes president. He pardons Confederates. He's not interested in Black voting rights. And he really is interested in sort of a new union that maintains the racial caste system of the old, right? And so when you think about presidential Reconstruction, there's going to be Black people massacred in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866. You're seeing the rise of the Klan. A lot of this is emboldened by President Johnson's not just conciliatory policy for the South, but really a policy that's anti-Black. And radical Reconstruction is really going to be the opposite. Radical Reconstruction is really going to be an effort by congressional Republicans in the House and the Senate to consolidate enough power to provide a pathway for citizenship and dignity for Black America. And it's never going to be as radical as those who are redemptionists claim, because it's never going to be institutionalized in a way where, for instance, South Carolina is the only state in the Confederacy that's majority Black. So if you had Reconstruction in South Carolina, and for a time you do, for a time South Carolina Black folks are in charge of the state legislature, and there's a journalist, a white journalist, who notes at the time in 1873 that the Speaker of the House is Black, the clerks are Black, even the Black pages, you know, the little pages are coal Black, right? And using racist terms like Sambo and these different things. But really, if South Carolina Reconstruction had been allowed to take place, you'd have had a Black governor, Black lieutenant governor, 2 Black senators, and or progressive whites who were voted in with that Black majority, right? That's what you were going to get. And what you find is that even radical Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau, all these different things, it is almost impossible when you look community by community to maintain peace and to maintain law and order and safety in the new reconfigured landscape, because that's really what happens. And there's not enough Black people to protect themselves. So you look at the work of Stephen Hahn and Eric Fauner, and they're really basing their work on, you know, so many different archives and manuscripts, but also local work like Merlene Petrie's work on Black Reconstruction in Texas, for instance. And she's at Texas Southern. So many different local Black historians have done wonderful work on Reconstruction. Thomas Holt, of course, has done wonderful work on Reconstruction, but work state by state: Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Texas. How did it play out in these places? So in a lot of ways, when we think about the Reconstruction period, it's an experiment in multiracial democracy, but oftentimes Black communities are going to be attacked violently. So we often talk about the Black codes, which really prevented Black people from voting, from owning land. We talk about convict lease system, which really is the rise of the system of mass incarceration. And even way before James Q. Wilson and the whole quality of life crimes, convict leasing criminalized Black people who were unemployed in the reconstructed landscape. And it arrested them, and it had them working in turpentine mines, coal mines. It had them working in logging and in industry for private industry and giving local municipalities a fee for each convict, right? So it continued a kind of slave labor by another name. And of course, Douglas Blackman has his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Slavery by Another Name, from 2012. So when we think about Reconstruction, it's a pivotal period, and it's a complex period, because even as those physically violent attacks are happening, you do have major instances where Black communities are able to thrive. And you do have instances, South Carolina is a great example again, where Black Reconstruction in South Carolina, when you think about 1868 to 1876, Black folks there are able to invest in infrastructure and roads and bridges and create the first public school system in South Carolina. You know, one of the things I quote in the Third Reconstruction is Thomas Miller's "We Were 8 Years in Power." And this is all the way in 1895, where he's at the South Carolina Convention, and he's there as a witness to a convention that has been organized to strip Black men of voting rights in the state of South Carolina. And they will be successful all the way until the late 60s, you know, for the next 70 years. And that's why when you really look at Reconstruction, it takes all the way to 1895 with those state conventions, 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, and then the Wilmington Massacre to really extirpate and sort of try to eradicate the freedom dreams and the really democratic institutions that Black people, alongside at times whites, were building during those 3 decades.
So before we move on to another question, looking at a question that we have online talking about Reconstruction, and this is one of those counterfactual questions, but maybe you'll take it on. And it's from Guy Perdue, and he's asked, what do you think the impact of Reconstruction would have been if President Lincoln had not been assassinated, or if Johnson had been removed from office?
Oh, yeah. I think if Lincoln had not been assassinated and had served another term, I think you would have had more progress. I think there still would have been violence. I think Lincoln continued to rise to the occasion. So I think he would have become a supporter of Black voting rights. But it would have been imperfect, and I think one of the questions is what would have happened if you perhaps had another president after Lincoln other than U.S. Grant, because I think Ulysses Grant is a good person, but he's a very poor president and administrator, so there's so much corruption that's happening. There's high taxes. There's the Panic of 1873. So I would say Lincoln is big, but also what occurs after Lincoln. You might argue that if Lincoln had been president, maybe the Grant administration is better, but certainly Lincoln would have been, I don't think he would have been as radical as some of the most radical abolitionists wanted, but he would have been a lot better than Andrew Johnson. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, take a step back to, you mentioned those critical moments in each era that you pointed out in your book. And one of the 3 watershed moments that you talk about, the Reconstruction period, and the one for the Reconstruction post-Civil War is the 13th Amendment, and that's being passed. And a little bit later in your book, you refer to the 13th Amendment in this way, that it's one of the most profound bait and switches in American history. You've touched on that briefly, I think, but could you explain what you mean by that and its legacy through today?
Yeah, so the 13th Amendment ends racial slavery except in instances of punishment for a crime. So the problem with that language that was inserted and then ratified in December of 1865 is that crime became the new way to racialize Black people. So really, we shouldn't be surprised that there's over 2 million 2 million people in prison, and like 38% of them are Black, even though Black people are about 12% of the population. We should not be surprised at that, nor should we be surprised at, sort of police brutality or what we saw with George Floyd, and even in earlier instances, Watts in 1965, Miami in 1980, Chicago in 1919, where the police rioted. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, the police are part of that riot against Black people. So that's a bait and switch, because we end servitude and slavery, and then we say, but here are the instances where we can do it. And we continue. Right now, we have Black people and other people in prison in Angola and plantations, Angola, Louisiana, right? So we never really stopped in certain ways using this major system of punishment and connecting race to that system of punishment. So we celebrate the end of the 13th or the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the end of racial slavery, but we're loath to admit that we just sort of substituted something else for it. And that's why there's always going to be, up until today, there are always crime scares and notions of crime waves. And the people who are always the culprits are allegedly Black people. This is both during racial slavery, antebellum slavery, but certainly after. And this idea that Black people are sort of criminalized and Black communities are devalued, and it provides a justification for violence against those communities. So that language really hurt us, and it continues to hurt us.
The Reconstruction era, at least immediately after the Civil War and after the amendments, there was this really explosion of African-American men who were serving in various levels of government, up to, I think, 2,000 African-American men or so over that Reconstruction period. But by 1901, and eventually I think there were 7 or 8 members of Congress.
Even more. There was like 13, 1915
Yeah. But in the early
multi.
1870s, there were about 7 or 8 elected into the House of Congress, including senators. One of them was Hiram Rhodes Revels, who you mentioned in your
Hiram
book.
Revels, Blanche
Yeah,
K. Bruce.
and would you mind telling the audience a little bit about him and what his experience was like?
Yeah, Hiram Revels is really a remarkable figure who becomes a senator for Mississippi, and he's a figure who uh, uh, is very impactful, but for probably a shorter period of time than he should have been. This is when the U.S. Senate was not voted in a popular way. It was voted by state legislators, basically. And both Revels and Blanche K. Bruce become, and these are folks who have education. These are folks who have some kind of access. There are some elected officials who are also formerly enslaved, who become elected officials who learn to read and write. But Revels is somebody who pushes for voting rights, who pushes for Black Reconstruction in Mississippi, including providing access for Black folks to become farmers and own their own land, because agriculture is the big deal in that context, even though it's a rapidly industrializing US landscape. And when you think about Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, they're not going to be able to serve full terms because a Reconstruction in Mississippi really ends quite abruptly. So neither of them serves a full 6-year term. And they're caught up in the turmoil of the period where you have competing governments. You'll have governments that are Republican and Democrat who are making claims to be the actual true government. And really, most of those instances, Democrats prevent legal Republican governments from winning. And when we think about Democrats versus Republicans then and now, the parties have switched, of course. The modern Republican Party is really the politically realigned former Democratic or Dixie Party, and the modern Democratic Party is actually really the grand old party of abolition and Lincoln.
And so, as you mentioned, that there was this abrupt end to the role of African Americans, particularly in places like Mississippi. Another thing that you mentioned, I think this is tied into it, is something called the Mississippi Plan. And there are all of these things that, most of us hadn't heard of, at least going through, high school and other history courses. And we'll talk about that in a moment, why that was. But this is an interesting case. And if you could share that in a little more detail, what was the Mississippi Plan and how was it carried out?
Yeah, the Mississippi Plan became a model for how to end Reconstruction in the old Confederacy, and it really just basically revolved around terrorizing local Black communities and making sure that they wouldn't come out to vote, really threatening Black elected officials and Black communities, and really creating new state constitutions that excluded Black folks. Part of their plans were introducing things like the grandfather clause in Louisiana and other places that said if your grandfather could vote, you could vote, but if your grandfather had not been able to vote, you could not vote. They introduced all these different things that basically subverted the 14th and the 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is birthright citizenship. The 15th Amendment is Black male suffrage. And really, the Supreme Court does not do anything about that. So you're gonna see different plans that basically exclude Blacks from having political participation at the local and the state and the federal level. And so many different states are gonna follow these up. But the remarkable thing is that, again, a place like Wilmington, North Carolina, and other places are able to keep enough political power and sometimes align with white Republicans and even certain white Democrats in these so-called fusionist tickets, right? Because the fusion party is really sometimes people talk about fusionism as this unadulterated positive, but it's more complex than that. Fusionism is really this idea of at times white and black Republicans getting together, at times white and black Republicans and Democrats getting together and saying they're going to do power sharing, right? Because especially whether we're talking about rural towns, Jeff, or cities, the more black people were there, the more antagonized a lot of times whites were, right? And sometimes a fusionist ticket would lessen the antagonism. And so what that basically meant when you think about fusionism were that a lot of times black people could be in a district and actually have the majority of votes, knowing that there's enough black men in this district who are overwhelmingly Republican for obvious reasons, right? The Democrats were this white supremacist party, this violent party. So the Republicans were doesn't mean the Republican Party was perfect, but they were overwhelmingly Republicans. It meant that that majority decided to align with a white population in that area and actually accept less than their fair share of political power to keep peace. And so what I mean by that is saying that, say, if we're in a district and we're predominantly whatever political party or ethnicity or whatever, if we have the votes, we can get together, Jeff, and say, we're gonna have a clean slate and we're gonna decide who's the Secretary of Treasury, who's the controller, who's the alderman, just the whole thing, right? We decide, right? It's sort of a winner take all. The fusionist perspective was saying, we don't want to antagonize. So we're going to say, even though we might be 60% here, we're going to take 30% of the political representation.
Was Hiram Revels in that camp?
Hiram Revels is a pragmatist. I mean, by the time, I think post 1875, he would be. I think when he's in office, he's just going to be a Republican, because there's a point where the early years of Reconstruction, there's a point where it doesn't seem like you're going to need a fusionist party. It just seems like if the Republican Party and the Congress and the Supreme Court and the military all get together and curtail the violence, then we can actually have the one man, one vote of that period. And again, it is one man, one vote until 1920, right? I'm not saying I like this, I'm saying that's just the facts. They're saying women can't vote. So there is and that's why what's so interesting, because we had the counterfactual earlier, Jeff. If Reconstruction works, you're going to get Barack Obama much earlier. You're going to get Barack Obama much earlier. If Reconstruction works during that time period, you're not going to get racially segregated public schools deep into the 20th century. You're not going to get separate hospitals. You're not going to get a separate military. You're going to get, maybe you're going to have, one party that's anti this, but if you had that multiracial Republican Party, you're going to get Black generals. You're going to get, you're just going to get a racially integrated political structure where you're going to get a Black vice president. You're going to get all that stuff. Even if gender-wise, you're not getting those breakthroughs to the 20th century. So a lot of it is that Reconstruction's failure, sets the nation back in a lot of different ways, because we create parallel institutions, the Black versions of which are underfunded and under-resourced, right? Yeah. So they're separate and sort of exploitative and unequal. So that's another counterfactual. Like if this works, we sort of transform the military, we transform corporate America, we transform the neighborhoods we all live in. We also transform how we're all perceiving European immigration too. Because if this works, you're going to have generations of Blacks and whites who, before a sort of new massive influx of European immigration in the late 19th century, are sort of working together in this consolidated multiracial democracy, who for specific reasons that are going to be certain ways non-racial, are going to have their own trepidations about immigration. You know what I mean? And so if Reconstruction works, it's a reconfigured landscape that European immigrants are trying to integrate into, because they have to think about both Black and white political power in different ways.
And that obviously wasn't the case. And we, and you also write in the book, and it's obviously well known, that the first Reconstruction was also extremely violent period, especially for African Americans. And the KKK was founded in that era. Black codes, which you've already mentioned, began to make their appearance. African Americans were terrorized in their homes, murdered in many cases.
Yes.
And today, actually, April 13th happens to be the 150th anniversary of the Colfax massacre. Can you share that story and talk about that legacy as well?
Yeah, Colfax massacre is going to happen in 1873. And when we think about Colfax, I mean, Colfax becomes one of the many different racial pogroms that take place during this period. And there's going to be multiple of these sort of pogroms that take place. But Colfax, Louisiana is going to be an area where Black folks are trying to reconstruct Louisiana. And there's going to be really pushback against that. And the Colfax massacre is really going to be different white militia that push back against both Black groups that are voting, but also there's going to be Black paramilitary organizations that are trying to protect their right to vote. And so when we think about these pogroms, a lot of times these pogroms happen because Black people are either trying to vote or trying to actually exercise their right as newly elected officials, whether they're sheriffs or aldermen or county clerks. And there's going to be a huge response. A lot of the conflict at times happens outside of courthouses, where there are different competing groups who are saying that they are the legitimate government of this local municipality. So Colfax, alongside of Hamburg, South Carolina, alongside of New Orleans and Memphis, is an area where there's going to be basically a riot against Black folks, and Black folks defend themselves, but there's going to be reinforcement statewide from different white militia. So one of the things that happens as soon as the Civil War ends is both Blacks and whites, and this is interesting in the context of our own contemporary arguments over the Second Amendment, they each arm themselves. Blacks for self-defense, whites in their mind for self-defense, but it's really offensive arming. It's really offensive arming. But both groups feel they're arming themselves for self-defense. And so you really have these two armed camps, but one armed camp has much more resources. So Colfax is a great example where white racial terrorists in a lot of places in the reconstructed South, it was hard to distinguish between racial terrorists, the police, independent militias, and state troops and military troops. It was very, very hard to distinguish that. And really by 1873, this is 4 years before the last Union troops are really removed, there's also a panic, or what we would call a Great Depression in 1873. And a lot of people blame the efforts at Reconstruction and Black people for that panic. So in a lot of ways, there is not the kind of federal response or local response to the massacre that you would have liked, even though the Klan Acts have been passed. And 1873 is really interesting because this is 2 years after the hearings in May of 1871 of Klan violence, right? And so the Colfax massacre becomes just another instance of the way in which the Mississippi plans are gonna take place through these reigns of terror. And that's why by the 1870s, we start to see some Black folks migrating out west to Kansas and out west to California and leaving the South because they're so they're being terrorized. And when we think about these massacres, sometimes people are massacred on their own farms. Sometimes people are terrorized wherever they're working. If they become blacksmiths, if they have anything that is flourishing, local whites can really resist that And this is way before Tulsa in 1921. Tulsa is just an example of sort of Black people leaving the South, going to Oklahoma, building up this thriving community, and having the local whites burn buildings and massacre over 300 Black people. But way before Tulsa, where we should look is Reconstruction in the period we're talking about. And Colfax is something that enough people still don't know about Colfax, Louisiana. But there's many more. There's many more.
Absolutely. And obviously we've been living through an era of great change and how the Civil War and that era is interpreted, just in the fact of all the removal of monuments that have taken place over the past decade. I mentioned David Blight in that same series of lectures that he gave. One thing he said was that he had no idea if and when those statues would come down. This was back in 2009, talking about Monument Avenue in Richmond and all those things. And I mentioned that because I was planning for this and I thought about the Colfax riot, I remembered that there was a monument or marker put up for the Colfax thing, and a bad picture of it, but there it is. And this was put up in 1951 by the Louisiana Department of Commerce and Industry to mark that event. And this is what it said. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South.
Yeah.
That's how it was interpreted all the way up until May 15th of 2021, when it was finally removed. And that speaks to one last question on the Reconstruction era, but the legacy of the lost cause and that narrative. Many people who study the Civil War have an understanding of what that is and that impact. But would you mind, if for folks who may not have a good understanding, you write about this in your book as well, what is the lost cause narrative, and how did it impact the memory that we have today of the Civil War, and particularly Reconstruction?
Yeah, and David Blight's book, Race and Reunion, is really an extraordinary book on the lost cause. So the lost cause is really a story that explains the Civil War and Reconstruction as sort of as a fever dream of sort of white Northern malfeasance and Black incompetence, right? And so it lionizes the South, it lionizes the Klan. It basically is this big fairy tale and this big lie, but it becomes institutionalized in our K through 12 system really in the 19th century, even before the Dunning School at Columbia University. There are different folks who are connected to the Daughters of the Confederacy who make sure that Southern textbooks will lionize and present an unreal portrait of what happened during the Civil War. And that's where the lost cause is, where you get the idea of happy enslaved people who were really, really satisfied, and they were, they were being treated greatly, and there's sort of tea and mint juleps in the South. So it's basically gone with the wind. But it's also Birth of a Nation. It's Birth of a Nation, where you've got white actors in blackface sort of terrorizing women who are willing to jump off a cliff rather than be raped by these Black soldiers, right? And so that lost cause is very, very important because it rationalizes white supremacy. It rationalizes the subjugation, dehumanization of Black folks. And it's become part and parcel of American exceptionalism. And I talk about American exceptionalism throughout the book, this idea that, America is this imperfect union that's constantly getting better. But what American exceptionalism doesn't acknowledge is that these are not aberrations. These are really juxtapositions, you can have racial progress and racial backlash exist simultaneously. And the lost cause really impedes us from ever squarely reckoning with this history and reckoning it in a way that is transformative in a positive way for all of us. And we're still facing that now with Florida and the state I live in, Texas, trying to ban books, trying to ban the study of history, and dozens of other states doing it too. Those policies and that legislation are absolutely lost cause inspired legislation that we're facing today. So one way to ennoble us all is to remove the lost cause from as an ideological pillar when we think about America.
Yeah, and many people have probably seen over the last couple of years that the military bases, in particularly in the South, are being renamed, for example. And someone on our message mentioned Robert Smalls, which is a fascinating story if you're not familiar with it. But just recently, a destroyer in the U.S. Navy, named after the Battle of Chancellorsville, which of course was a loss for the United States, has been renamed the Robert Smalls. So there's these small things that take place that will transform that culture. But we only have a couple minutes left, and one thing that I definitely wanted to get to, and that you mentioned throughout your book, is the role of Black women, particularly in this story, in this struggle. This gets back to your own family and your mother, but also people like Ida B. Wells. Can you take a few minutes to introduce everyone to Ida B. Wells and what her legacy is and who sort of carrying on that tradition today?
Yeah, Ida B. Wells was from Holly Springs, Mississippi, even though she makes her big mark in Memphis as this anti-lynching advocate and crusader. And she's the first person who's sort of a data scientist, political activist. She writes a book called The Red Record and many other books and pamphlets. And she really goes and investigates sites of lynching. She publicly is banned from Memphis after saying that there are white women who are sleeping with Black men and willingly. And it's not about Black men raping white women as a justification for lynching, which is really violating a taboo of the time period. And so Ida B. Wells becomes one of my anchors, looking at how Black women are key to really reimagining American democracy over these 3 periods of Reconstruction. In the first 2 periods, people like Ida B. Wells and Frances Harper and Mary Church Terrell are doing it. And in the second period, it's people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Angela Davis. And in the third period, it's the folks like Tamika Mallory and Stacey Abrams, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and so many others. And I think what's interesting about Black women doing this is that they call for a very, very expansive vision of American democracy because they're excluded in the 19th century. They're excluded even in the 20th century. No Black woman is allowed to speak at the March on Washington, for example, right? So often ideas of freedom get caught up in patriarchy within the Black community and externally. And so when you think about even somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project, I make the point that it's really important for us to think about democracy as expansive enough to include Black women as co-architects of our democratic imagination, because by doing so, we can move to an era where we're no longer scapegoating folks within the American family, because that's kind of our biggest problem, whether we're going to say we're going to scapegoat people who are disabled or scapegoat people who are queer. As soon as you're in a room and you're saying tag, that's the person I want to exclude. That's the problem, So like what you're trying to build is whether somebody is Jewish or Muslim or Christian or atheist, that we're all in this together, whether the person's Republican or Democrat, whether the person's Episcopalian or Baptist, right? And so as soon as you say, here's the person we want to exclude, we're all in trouble, because who's next, right? That's the problem. And so Black women have been, I think, really bold in that sense, and even being courageous enough to push back against our, Christian churches and different churches who at times want to exclude people. Because like I always tell my students, the democracy is about not excluding anyone. And that's why some people get very upset, because everyone wants a scapegoat, irrespective of color. Even Black people within their community create scapegoats.
Right, it's their fault. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. The only way we get out of this is we say, you know what? It's not my neighbor's fault. It's not my fault. We're all going to get together and we work together. And guess what? We're not excluding anybody, and we're not hoping for anybody to go to prison or to be punished. That's how we get out of the situation we're in right now.
Well, we've been at this for a long time, and there seems to be a long time to go. And you mentioned to wrap up the conversation, we're a little bit over time, but we started a little late. You mentioned in the final chapter of the book that African Americans dream of living in a nation that loved them back. Right, that's something you mentioned. You also talk about Martin Luther King's, you mentioned it tonight, is the beloved community idea. So where do you see the struggle today, the struggle for a multiracial democracy? Do you have hope for the future? I know in the book you say you do. A year later, after finishing it, do you still have that hope?
Oh, no, absolutely. I think one example is what just happened in Tennessee in the legislature, where those two African-American young men were kicked out and then just recently reinstated. And it wraps up this whole Reconstruction conversation.
It does.
Because
And by the way, Justin Jones mentioned the third Reconstruction when he was in one of his. He must have read your book. So
the hope is that more people finally know the story, Jeff, because of 2020 and the aftermath. And I do think there are more white people than ever who are interested in Reconstruction and standing in solidarity with Black people and other people. That's all very, very, very hopeful. I think there's huge opportunities to both push back against efforts to ban this history and ban this teaching, and opportunities to actually share our stories with each other, because history is not just about the past. History is actually about the present and the future. And the stories we tell justify our actions. So we can tell a story about America that is unbelievably inclusive, that creates a safety net for millions of people, that doesn't ban anything or anybody or scapegoat anything or anybody. And if we tell that story, we can actually enact policies that way as well. Or we can tell a much harsher story, which we've done before. We've done anti-Semitism. We've done Japanese internment camps. We've done settler colonialism and eradicated whole portions of Native and indigenous populations, and also then justified it and built up monuments to the people who did it, right? Or we can tear those monuments down. So I think we have a great opportunity in front of us. And again, as we can see from studying the first two Reconstructions, it's going to be a difficult road because this is our history. Just like sometimes people say we can't go to another country and sort of install democracy. And I think they're right. Doesn't mean we can't help other countries because we don't have their history. Just like people don't have our history either. This Civil War, the Civil War that we all study and that we're obsessed with, the specific Civil War from 1861 to 1865 only happened here. Doesn't mean other countries don't have their own Civil War, Jeff, but all the people we talk about, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, that didn't happen in Puerto Rico or Sweden. That happened here. Right. That's our history, right? Right? Am I wrong? That didn't happen in Panama.
You're 100% right.
Ulysses S. Grant, right? He's from Panama, and that's their history. That's us, right? Right? And so the only way we can get out of it is by reconciling fully that entire history. And we need to understand this idea of a Reconstructionist multiracial democracy is really the most patriotic kind of story we can tell, because it's a story that says that even though America, there goes that doorbell, even though America is this multiracial democracy and that there's been highs and lows, we can build that beloved community through that multiracial democracy.
Yeah, there definitely should be room for everyone here. And you know, Peniel, thank you so much for agreeing to be our inaugural sailor on this journey of our Civil Conversation series. We really appreciate it. The book is extremely well written, by the way. I enjoyed reading it. Please purchase it. There it is. Now you get the idea. And buy it through our website. It supports Peniel and supports us. Thank you again so much. Good luck with your future work, and hope we'll have you back here someday down the road.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. And we'll have this up online at some point down the road as well. So thank you all. Have a good evening.